Yes, what's up? This is WARZONEJONES back again. I want to talk about the first time I ever got into pro wrestling. How pro wrestling was, hell, how I was, how old I was. And I gotta say, around the time I got into pro wrestling, it was probably the year 1993. At least 1993 is the year when I literally started to like pro wrestling. So around this time, guys in the WWE, or rather I should say the WWF, because at the time it was the WWF. So around this time, people in the WWF, it was guys like the top guys were Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Scott Hall, but he was Razor Ramon at the time. So Razor Ramon, Big Daddy Cool Diesel. Guys like that, The Undertaker. When The Undertaker was like younger. At this time, Undertaker probably was like 29, maybe even 30 years old, or maybe even a little bit younger. But these were the, like the it guys in the WWF. Owen Hart, the list goes on. So these were the guys who I first started watching, going on to the Attitude Era, going on to the era we got now, the PG era. It all started right here in the early 1990s. So this is when I started to watch pro wrestling. Back then, when I was a small little kid, was probably the most I was into a match. Now, when I say the most I was into a match, I used to just root for a certain wrestler, The Undertaker or Bret Hart. You used to say things like, get him, get him, get him. Like, when you're a kid, you're like, come on, get up, get up, get up, get up. Like, go ahead, get him, get him. So I remember when I used to watch pro wrestling with my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother, as old as she was, and she was a saved, sanctified saint, used to sometimes watch pro wrestling with me and my uncle, Saturday mornings. And we'll watch it, and we'll all be into the match because, that's just how you was when you were a kid. So when you see a lot of those kids, and they watch John Cena, and they're all into the match, they're cheering John Cena's name, they're trying to get him into the match. That's how I was for guys like Bret Hart. Guys like, Shawn Michaels, when they were baby faces, of course. So when you are a little kid, I would say that is the best time to get in pro wrestling, is when you are a little kid, because that's when everything is believable. That is when you just about believe in everything. Nothing is fake to you almost when you are a little kid. So I remember I used to hear things like they say wrestling was fake, but I didn't really believe that. To me, once upon a time, pro wrestling was real. So I thought guys like Bret Hart and The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon, I thought these guys were really trying to beat the hell out of each other. I literally thought that. So the guy who was ever winning the most, that was basically the guy who I was cheering for. If you were a good guy, I was going to cheer for you. I was going to naturally like you. If you were a bad guy, I wasn't going to cheer you. I was going to boo you. I wasn't going to like you. That's just how it is back when you are a kid. Nowadays, I don't really care who's the bad guy or who's the good guy. I'm not going to like a wrestler just because he's a good guy. I'm not going to hate a wrestler just because he's a bad guy, because there are good guy wrestlers who I sometimes just can't stand, and there are bad guy wrestlers who I do like, but at the same time, sometimes can't stand. So it's like both. So I would say a kid is the best time when you are to get in pro wrestling. Also around this time, they had a lot of wrestling video games. So I was playing the wrestling video games too back in like 94, 95, back when the Super Nintendo was out. I can't think of any game back then, but they did have wrestling games back then, like for the Nintendo and for the Sega. I remember this one wrestling game was like they had like powers, which was a little weird. I think it was Acclaim, which is the company that makes the Mortal Kombat games. I think that team created that game, Ed Boon. They created this like wrestling game where like these guys literally had like powers. It was like an arcade style video game, and the wrestlers were digitized like in the Mortal Kombat games back in the early 90s. So I remember playing games like that and pretending to actually be the wrestlers. So for you adults now, or even you kids, do you actually pretend to be the wrestlers now? Maybe you do, and for some of you adults, maybe you do. Maybe the people who wear the John Cena t-shirts, maybe you people pretend to be the wrestlers these days. I haven't pretended to be a wrestler in, hell, years, since I was a kid. I remember I used to always pretend to be The Undertaker. The Undertaker was my absolute most favorite wrestler. It still is today, like, of all time. If I do of all time list, Undertaker's going to be my number one guy. But The Undertaker was most definitely the guy who I was. So when all my friends, my family, when we was all picking the wrestlers that we were, The Undertaker, that was me. I wanted to be The Undertaker. So this is how I was around the first time I got into pro wrestling. So I was born in 1988. I couldn't watch the 80s, of course. I could only watch the 90s and now. So the early 90s were around the time I most definitely was watching pro wrestling, around at least 1993, because I can't remember the exact year, but I do know at least for sure 1993 and now. That's how long I've been watching pro wrestling. So, I just want to talk about around the time when I first got in pro wrestling. That's around the time when I first got in pro wrestling. I'm also going to talk about the other times when I first got into the topics that I talked about from video gaming, so watch out my first time I got in video gaming. I know how it was back then for me. Anime too, and even MMA. So make sure you watch out for those topics. I want to talk about those because, well, those are the topics that I talk about on this channel. So this is Warzone Jones. If you haven't done so, don't be afraid to click that subscribe button. Remember, you won't get a ticket if you click it. So, I'm out. Deuce.